In my 20s and most of my 30s, I kind of built a house of cards. And the house of cards were, I was successful at school. I was successful in my career. I had gotten married. I had kids. I had 3 kids. I did all the things you're supposed to do.
The American dream.
And I was still unhappy. And I think 9/11 and the economic collapse that we saw around the same time was kind of like a big wind on the house of cards. The whole thing just collapsed. All of that put me at a distance from the true me. The inner me and the outer me just weren't in alignment. And it was confusing because I was super successful and I was affirmed by the world. And the greater I felt, the worse I felt inside.
So today we have somebody that had made his career with the sharks of Wall Street, working for JP Morgan Partners, which is a private equity arm of JP Morgan Chase. And then at some point, he changed his entire career and became an executive coach. So now Jerry and I sort of kind of swim in the same pool. So let me introduce you to Jerry Colonna. Jerry, thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thank you for having me on the show.
All right. So, Jerry, we're going to talk about what your life was like back in the day when you still had hair. For the people that are hearing this podcast, they're not listening.
That's right.
But before we do, I want to ask you a question. Mm-hmm. And you can take a second to think about it. Tell the listeners something about you that most people don't know, that they can't find out about by Googling you, by talking to your friends or your colleagues, that's very much influence the trajectory of your career and who you are today.
Well, that's a tough question to answer, not because I have any hesitancy about saying anything, but because I have made a living out of revealing everything.
But everyone's got something. I had the head of a big company tell me he'd gotten fired from a job. He couldn't believe he'd never told him. He couldn't believe he was telling me that.
It's a tough one. I will have to take the risk of telling you something that some folks may already know.
Okay. I'll allow that.
Because I can be very literal. So if someone says, tell me something no one else knows, or it's a hard one.
Well, you were a private equity guy. It had to be precise. The numbers had to be precise, right?
Well, we can have that conversation. I think that there are multiple types of private equity guys. I was not.
Yeah, we'll get to that later. We'll get to that later. Yeah.
I think the thing that probably people don't necessarily track is that I started my career first as a journalist, by the way, and then became
writing for whom? Writing for whom?
For a small magazine on Long Island called Information Week. It was a technology-focused magazine at a publisher. But what people don't know is that I began that career before I actually finished graduating, and started working full-time. Graduating college. And so I went to work and started developing my career one credit short of my BA. Mm-hmm. And I remember one day getting a phone call from the development office at Queens College, which was very excited to have found me as a potential donor. And they said, well, alumni. And I said, hold on, I'm not an alumni. And I said, what? And I said, well, I'm one credit short and I've never had the. So anyway, we cut a deal. I went back and I taught for 4 years and they gave me the one credit. So
I think they came out way ahead.
I think they came out ahead too.
So all the years that you were working and on, those god awful applications, especially for banks, you didn't
What
have to check the
applications?
box to get a job.
Oh,
You didn't have to check. You didn't have to check the box where you went to school. I mean, when you got graduated.
I would just put the dates down. So I was in school for 4.5 years, but they never actually asked. So, and it wasn't that many applications. Remember, I only had 2 jobs. The job I started while I was still a student, and I stayed in that position for 10 years, and then later on.
Okay, so how did you? What prompted the switch from being a journalist, being a writer, and it's the tech industry? So back in the day, you're sort of kind of you're in the midst of the revolution, right? Everything's starting to. You were there before iPhones, before Apple, right? You saw the birth of that. I take it.
Well, not before Apple existed, but certainly before the iPhone. So there were 2 major career switches. The first was out of journalism and into investing.
Mm-hmm.
And that occurred.
Happen?
Well, I was about 29 years old, and I was facing my coming up on almost 10 years working for the same company. And quite honestly, I was a little freaked out because when I was a kid, probably one of the most consequential memories of many was watching my father lose his job at after 30 years with the same company.
Oh, that drives me crazy.
I was 10, and it was the first time I ever saw him cry, and it scared me. And as a consequence, I've come to realize after many years of therapy and good internal analysis, I've come to realize that it kind of shaped me, and it made me suspicious of being too dependent upon any one entity. So there was that as an issue. And then there was the rise of the internet. And so we're talking about like 1994. And my job had evolved over the time from being a reporter to being what was called the director of interactive media. I was responsible for bringing all of our magazines and newspapers onto the internet. And while that was going on, I attracted the attention of a number of different folks outside my company, one of which worked at Microsoft, who began recruiting me to run what was then called MSN, their original internet offering. And I didn't want to do it, but I also didn't want to stay at the same company. And I was introduced to another friend who was starting a venture capital fund, and out of the blue, he invited me to join. And that took me into investing as a career. And what I did at that point was I applied my skills as a technology journalist to the process of actually evaluating businesses. And most important and most relevant to what I do now, really evaluating human beings. Because as an investor, the most important decision you're making, it's not about the numbers, it's about the people. Is this someone worth investing? Yeah.
I mean, I coach private equity, VC, and they bring me in so that when they do what they're doing, they can see especially if they do a merger or buy, they don't kill each other, right? Because all that money then, right? And it's the cultural fit from a human behavior perspective. But I want to go back to your dad for a moment. What were some of the other ramifications for witnessing that? And you know, I'm so touched by that because I tell people all the time, and it's one of the reasons why I'm an entrepreneur. Like companies are notorious for I'm making it up, but if you get a pension at 20 years, at 19 years, everybody gets laid off. Like it's and to me, it's brutal. So was your dad? Was he able to regroup? Was he part of a layoff, or was he? But we didn't have massive layoffs until like the 80s, right?
So that's not what happened to my father. What happened to my father was And I actually, in both of my books, Reboot and Reunion, I spend a great deal of time telling my father's stories. But my father began working for this small printing firm when he was in high school in the 1930s and early 1940s. And he took a break, went to war, was part of the occupying force in Europe after the war, worked for the newspaper, the Stars and Stripes newspaper. I'll interject something. Covered the Nuremberg trials as a reporter.
Wow.
Which meant visiting camps like Auschwitz while it was months, years, just short time after the camps had been liberated.
Like why it was semi-active-ish? Is that what you're saying?
Wasn't active.
Like still happening, but...
Well, as my father would say, late night over a beer, Jerry, I could still smell it.
Oh.
Okay. He came back. He had married my mother. They had 7 kids. I'm number 6 of 7. And by the early 1970s, what had happened was that the rise of computer-assisted typography had put out of business small firms like my father's, where they would literally cast typecast in lead. And they would lay out magazines and newspapers and that sort of thing. So it was consequential for him because the president of the firm was the son of the founder of the firm. And it was a very benevolent firm. I remember, for example, that I had 6 siblings. They would pay the hospital bills for each one of our births. It was that kind of a small firm. My father, and again, more context here, my father had a lifelong relationship with depression, not unlike my own lifelong relationship with depression. And my mother was mentally ill. My father had alcoholism going on as well. And so when he lost his job, he lost his identity. And I would say while he worked again, thankfully because of the union, which got him positions, he never really regained his grounding. And he died about 20 years later at 67.
And is your mom still alive?
My mother passed about 6 years ago. She lived to 85. And if you want to go down and talk about my mother's mental illness, we can do that.
Well, I just wondering, was she treated for it or nobody talked about that stuff back then?
No, she was treated for it. In the 1960s, she began having postpartum depression and severe catatonia after the birth of one of my older sisters. And from, I would say, 1958, 59 or so, through the birth of my younger brother, she would often be hospitalized continuously. So, for example, after my birth, she was hospitalized 3 days after I was born for, we think it was about 2 weeks. And I have very, very vivid memories of going to visit her in the hospital. And so most of my childhood and that of my siblings is marked by mom disappearing, mom being taken away, sometimes even being taken away in a straitjacket. And then us children being dispersed among relatives throughout Brooklyn.
Wow.
As my therapist, my longtime psychoanalyst used to say to me all the time, not bad considering.
Well, that reminds me of the line, everything's relative, right? Right. But there's so much of what you're talking about is not, pieces of it is not as unusual as sometimes we think it is when we're experiencing it. But perhaps having all of it, like, the people that fought in the World War II, and anyone that saw battle or what your dad did, many of them had post-traumatic stress. We didn't know what it was, right? So you have the alcoholism, you don't know how to handle it. Mental illness, there's not a family on the planet that doesn't have mental illness in it. It's just a matter of whether it's acknowledged or not, or if it's spoken about or not. So I'm wondering if there's a connection for you, though, between you from where you are growing. Were you into sport? What brought you joy growing up? Were you into sports, music, drama? What did you do?
I was a writer.
Did you always write?
I have kept a journal continuously since I was 13 years old.
Wow. Was that a way? Was that 60. Cathartic? Was that cathartic?
Absolutely.
You look so much younger. Yeah.
That was my first therapist.
Yeah. Well, right. And we know now the benefit of journaling.
Right. And I'm also a really inquisitive person. So I would read literally dozens of books a year. And, I again, in both Reboot, my first book, and Reunion, my current book, the new book, I tell stories from my childhood because it's a way, as I often say, it's a way of taking a fix on my life. It's kind of, I often think of that sailor in the dark in an ocean shooting the stars and figuring out, where the heck am I? Right? Triangulating in that way. And stories help me to sort of make sense of everything and help me interpret what's going on. They were the ways in which, as a child, there was also enormous violence in the household, and often associated with my father's drinking, but not always exclusively that. It was really So
he would black out, he would get violent?
He would not black out, he would get violent, but the real violence was amongst the siblings. And then we also lived in a very violent neighborhood. We lived in a very poor neighborhood in Brooklyn. And there was a lot of tension in the neighborhood. So much of my childhood included beatings. And the way to make sense of that, and of course, initially making sense of it was very, very difficult. But the way to make sense of it, aside from 35 years in psychoanalysis, I have, the image I often carry is, I think of our ancestors sitting around campfires, telling myths and stories, trying to make sense of a world that could feel really overwhelming. And so for me, telling stories, connecting to other humans that way, was a way through what I had experienced. And to your point earlier, opened up the possibility of hearing other people's stories, which then made it didn't quite normalize the situation, but it made it less overwhelming.
Less alone. Yeah.
That's it.
I'm sorry that you went through that, but I also we know that, the difficult times, the hardships, the trials is what makes us who we are today, and the strength, right?
The way I see it, Patty, is because clients and people who read my stuff often ask, well, is it necessary to experience that level of wounding? And the answer is no. It's not necessary.
Yeah.
And we don't want to romanticize trauma.
Of course not.
But we are the sum total of all that has happened.
Right.
And what we, one of my favorite lines is from Carl Jung, who said, I am not what has happened to me. I am what I choose to become.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's been any guiding principle in my development, it's really been that. What do I choose to make of this situation?
Well, okay. So let's go here then. Okay. So two things. One is Jerry, the expression I like is my past doesn't define me. It informs me. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We live in a world today,
mm-hmm.
and this happens in corporations as well. Everybody loves to play the victim. Mm. Everybody loves to act. Now, I was telling you earlier, I grew up in Brooklyn, right? In Brooklyn, you went out to play. You went out and played. And you played stickball, and you played corkalivio, and you played all these things, and you played triangle, and you played stoop ball. I know you know some of these.
I know all of them.
And you would get into fights and scuffles, and you wouldn't talk, or you'd be fighting, whatever. And then everybody's mother would call you in for dinner, and you better be home for dinner. Mm-hmm. Nobody's parents.
Usually when the street lights clicked on.
That's correct. And nobody's mothers got involved with, and you didn't go home and talk about Johnny did this to me and corkalivio. Nobody cared. Not that they didn't care about you, but that was your world. And then you had your family world, right? And what it's done is, and I see this with my work as an executive coach, is it gave us all what we used to call soft skills, which I like the name, the human skills. It gave us all the skills on how to communicate, conflict resolution. And you could have been mortal enemies with somebody on Monday. And Tuesday, you went out to play and you were on each other's side, and it was forgotten. So you learned conflict resolution. You learned communicate. You learned how not to hold a grudge. You did not identify yourself as the victim. Mm. Today, I feel like, including as a coach, everybody basks in the light of being a victim because now it's not their fault. So how have you used your knowledge growing up and your work as a coach, having done years as private equity, right? How have you used your background to transform to businesses and executives to be successful, to not embrace being a victim, to take ownership, to make that choice? Because my guess is that's probably one of your geniuses.
Well, I don't know if it's a genius. That would be for somebody else to define. But I will tell you that one of the areas that I'm focused on, I don't have quite the same reaction that you have to what that's I would say to people feeling and presenting themselves as a victim. But I understand what you're talking about.
I'm just giving another perspective. That's all.
And the way I think about it, I've been a coach now for 22 years. Mm-hmm. And before making that transition, I would go in and, or even after I made that transition, I was working with a psychoanalyst that I started working with when I was 30. She was also from Brooklyn. She was tough.
Can I ask you, why did you choose psychoanalysis as opposed to psychotherapy? Because it's different.
It's very different. And I did not choose it. I went to see a therapist and I did not know that it was psychoanalysis until about 6 years later. And I've been spending all that time on the couch. In hindsight, I think it was right for me and I appreciated it. But one of the I'll give you two questions that emerged from my work with Dr. Sayers, who, God rest her soul, she passed about 7 years ago at 93. One time I had just started a venture capital firm called Flatiron Partners. And I
Mhm.
was out at the beach with my family, and I was struck down by a migraine that I had never experienced before, this intensity. So bad that I went to the hospital, and I was in the hospital for a week.
Wow.
Now, to be clear, I grew up with migraines. Okay. I went through, got a battery of tests. Everything was the neurologist basically said, damned if I know. Okay. I go to therapy shortly afterwards, and Dr. Sayers, I'm lying on the couch, and she says to me, damn it, Jerry, what are you not saying that you need to say? And I was like, what? And she said, what are you not saying that you need to say? Very powerful question.
Hmm. I ask it at work all the time. Nothing changes until the unspoken is spoken.
A corollary question that she asked me to consider at some point, which I evolved over time, which I use in my own work, is how have I been complicit, not responsible, in creating the conditions I say I don't want? Now, this is a really important structure because it's complicit, not responsible, because it's not designed to seek guilt. Because what happens when we seek guilt is the defenses kick in and the lack of curiosity. And the second half of that is that I say I don't want. Now, what's important about that is, and you're familiar with this, the notion of the secondary benefit. I say I don't want to be busy all the time, but damn, does it make me feel good? Because then I'm productive, right? And so when I go forward and I encounter somebody who is beginning to see themselves as a victim, my goal is to pop that bubble as quickly as possible. Classic example, I tell this story in Reboot, my first book. Client comes in complaining about his greedy SOB head of sales. What a terrible guy. Terrible, terrible. Who hired him? Oh, me. Who hasn't fired him? Oh, me. What possible use could his greed have for you? Oh, I don't have to be greedy because my head of sales is greedy. I get to be benevolent. My hands are clean, right? So the way I like to work, and it was really my first model for this was Dr. Sayers, was to kind of cut through what I would call the bullshit machine, where we tell ourselves, this person is doing this to me. This person is doing this to me. And absolve ourselves of any responsibility for creating the conditions that we're sitting there complaining about. That's the way I go at the victim question, rather than, because sometimes people occasionally are victim. Right?
Sure.
What my parents did to me when I was a kid, it sucked.
That's right. As an adult, though, you have access to different choices.
And as an adult, I have agency.
Right.
And I do not have to pretend that I don't have the capacity to change my circumstances. That's where I become complicit in the victimization.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to ask you the question that I ask my clients. So your sales guy is a greedy SOB. Okay. How does that serve you?
Exactly. That's the question.
Yeah.
How does it serve you to cut through that? Because what I have found is that most folks don't want to see that something persists because it's in service to something else. Right. And I love that question because when we go there, we get to surface, well, I'm really terrified that the company's going to run out of money. Well, why are you so afraid of that? Well, when I was a kid, this happened and this happened. My father lost his job. Okay. So how it's possible that the company's going to run out of money, but how probable is it? Oh, it's not probable. Okay. So do you still need the defenses that you needed when you were a kid? Or maybe it's time to put those defenses down and open yourself up to more possibility. Maybe, again, you have more agency than you pretend.
Okay, so Jerry, so how do you get the job offer from your friend, and how do you rock and roll through that?
You mean the transition to becoming a venture capitalist?
Yeah, VC. Yeah, very
Well,
different world than what you were working.
it was more adjacent than you would imagine, right? Because I
Okay,
was a
so tell us.
technology reporter, and part of my job was to separate the bullshit from the reality. Somebody would walk in with a press release and say,
Gosh, do
"Look
we
at
need
this
that?
thing."
Do we need that today?
Right. And when I became a VC, I was very, very skilled at being able to see through the marketing nonsense and say, okay, there's an opportunity here. I also began to use the other skill I had developed as a reporter, which I would say is listening. Listening for what's not being said,
Mm-hmm.
listening for what's really going on, all of which were skills that I developed as a kid to survive the adverse conditions that I grew up with. I could tell just by listening to the tone of my father's voice whether he was going to get violent or not.
Mm-hmm.
And if he was going to get violent, I'd make myself scarce.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's actually a pretty useful skill when you're a reporter, because you can tell whether somebody's lying or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when you become an investor, you can tell whether someone actually believes the story they're telling you. Because if they don't believe it, you shouldn't believe it.
Right.
So it was very adjacent. It felt very natural. And I became later, when my partner and I, Fred Wilson, launched Flatiron Partners, we became the darlings of the first wave of internet investing. We were kind of rock stars because everything we touched turned to gold.
Because of your skill set, partly of your skill set.
And partly because of luck.
Most people, well, yeah, but most people, I would imagine, in the VC world, though, have finance backgrounds, no?
Yes, they do. If you define finance background as having an MBA.
Yeah, I do.
Most people would have an MBA. What I had was extrasensory perception around human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And that became a competitive advantage for sure.
Well, you had the degree everybody that grew up in Brooklyn and Queens had back in the day. And by the way, for the listeners that are young, the Brooklyn and the Queens that we're talking about is not the Brooklyn and the Queens that you are dying to move to. Because we grew up there, we couldn't wait to get out. And now you can't afford to move back in. It's not at all what your reference is. So read down these main streets. That'll give you a sense of what it was like back then.
Or Jonathan Letham's The Fortress of Solitude, about growing up in Brooklyn in the 1970s.
Correct.
Yeah.
And actually, a Tree Grows in Brooklyn was about a girl. I think her father was an alcoholic. I don't remember that whole story. But the credentials that I'm saying you have is that you, and I see this today as well. You came from the school of hard knocks. So an Armani suit doesn't fool you.
That's right. I'm not easily fooled by people.
Right. Well, that's the Brooklyn Queens radar. Wherever we go in the world, we find each other. You know. Right. All right. So share with us a time when maybe your ESP didn't work for you, and what happened, and how'd you regroup?
I think that the way to really understand that isn't so much where the ESP didn't work. I think the implicit question there is, so if you were doing so well, why did you leave the business?
No, I'm not. No, I'm saying while you're in the middle. Look, this as awesome as anyone is, they're not going to get 100% of the shots they take, right? So I would imagine along the way. So we'll get to why you left, but when you're in it and you're loving it and you're good at it and you have a gift, right? Well, right. But sometimes those gifts, you don't get 100% of the shots 100% of the time. So how would you regroup, right? Because today a lot of people have a very difficult time when they, to lack of a better word, fail. Things don't go according to plan. Did you have any of that inner critic going on?
I had and can still hear the inner critic's voice, but it's not so much around failure. And I think actually, to go back to my father losing his job, one of the decisions I made at 10 years old was that I was never going to depend upon anybody else. Now, that sounds resilient and great, except it's also a little bit fucked up. And, basically,
the capacity for intimacy and vulnerability and all that trust.
Well, I have no problem being intimate and vulnerable. I mean, I think I'm demonstrating that here. But the larger issue is, for me, and the way it manifested, it continues to manifest, is I am my own savior. I am responsible for my success or failure, which means no one is going to outwork me. No one is going to outthink me. And if I fail, it won't have been because I didn't try. So I used to say to myself, say to people all the time, you could drop me on a desert island and I will make money selling lemonade to myself, because I will always figure out a way. Where I get into trouble is when I'm part of a larger company where I am subjected to other people's decisions and other forces at work. And what if they make the wrong decision? See, I don't mind making the wrong decision myself. I made it, oops, okay. But I loved being part of a 2-3 person venture firm because it was just us.
Yeah.
But put me, where I ended up at JP Morgan, where there were 500 other investors that I hated that. I hated that. Not because failure or success, but because I did not have the agency to control the situation.
Too many levels of bureaucracy. I definitely can see that. So were you there for a short time then?
I was there for a year. Yeah. And within 3 months.
Why so long?
Well, within 3 months of signing the contract, I knew I'd made a mistake.
So why did you jump from where you were? You were from the small firm that you were with your friend. So what happened there? Because it sounds like you were loving life. You were the tech darlings.
No. We were the tech darlings until the first internet collapse happened. And then everything we touched turned to shit. And that's when, this was 2000, 2001. And in the summer of 2001, I began, JP Morgan, which was our prime backer at the time, said, well, we're not so sure we want to do what we've been doing for the last 10 years. And we began negotiating to break the relationship. And then 9/11 hit.
Right.
And I was on a plane to DC the morning of 9/11. And it rocked my world. I lost friends. I felt my city was under attack. And I threw myself into the recovery efforts afterwards. I helped launch a $15 million recovery fund for small businesses in the trade center area. I became executive director of the Olympic bid effort. We were trying to bring the 2012 games to New York City. That was all an effort to defend my city, to defend my home.
Oh, I did it as a native New Yorker. My brothers went to 70 funerals.
Right.
My mother was in the city. My brother married into a New York City fireman family. I mean, started his career at Cantor Fitzgerald. I mean, a lot.
Right. So you remember what that time was like, and
I still feel people don't always get it. That don't live in this area. They do not get it. Yeah.
They don't get that. We could be politically opposed to one another, but we were united in defending our city.
Unbelievable. Yes. And don't mess with New Yorkers.
You do not, don't see, don't make me cry. You do not mess with New Yorkers.
Yeah.
Because I will take you out.
Mm-hmm.
As sure as I can look you in the eye, I will take you out. And that's what it felt like. I mean, I know the country was attacked, but intellectually I know that. But what it felt like was my city was attacked.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those firefighters, the sanitation workers, the ones who run into the fire, the cops.
Yep.
The ones who for months work the pile to find people.
Yep.
So
and
when
everybody
that
still
happened,
isn't found. Everybody still isn't found.
God rest their souls. So that changed me, that experience. And I began to question, what the fuck was I doing? Why am I worrying about this or worrying about that? Consequently, I did take a job with JP Morgan that September. I accepted the job on September 10th.
Now, okay.
September 11th happens.
Yeah.
I am transitioning. I'm not at that point saying I'm not going to go work there, but I'm doing all this.
No, they're not
work.
there. They're off-site. Was there a satellite office in Jersey where they were? Where were they? Nobody was going to the World Trade Center.
They were at 270 Park. They were uptown.
Okay. Oh, that's right. They're by
Grand Central.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. They actually own like a whole
totally different
there.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, I was back at work at JP Morgan on September 13th. And what I did was I gathered 20, 30 associates and we went to Brooklyn to the Arab area on Atlantic Avenue to have dinner at a Lebanese restaurant to demonstrate the fact that you don't mess with fucking New Yorkers. And that we weren't going to get caught up in this anti-Islamic nonsense, that there were terrorists, and that a guy who runs a restaurant on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn isn't a terrorist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He's just a guy trying to feed his family.
Running a restaurant. Yeah.
Running a restaurant, not all that different from my uncle who ran an Italian restaurant for 30 years in Brooklyn. What's the difference?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
falafel and pasta.
Right. So that rolled into 2002. And by February of 2002, I was terribly depressed again and suicidal.
Because of the lack of agency that you found there? Or on top of the terror?
I think what happened was the image that I hold on to is in my 20s and most of my 30s, I kind of built a house of cards. And the house of cards were, I was successful at school. I was successful in my career. I had gotten married. I had kids. I had 3 kids. I did all the things you're supposed to do.
The American dream. Yeah.
And I was still unhappy. And I think 9/11 and the economic collapse that we saw around the same time was kind of like a big wind on the house of cards. The whole thing just collapsed. And to the point where the depression, which I had suffered throughout my childhood, including in my late teens, I was hospitalized for a suicide attempt. I mean, when I talked about growing up with migraines, it was intense. All of that, all of the house of cards, which had meaning and was authentic, put me at a distance from the true me. The inner me and the outer me just weren't in alignment. And it was confusing because I was super successful and I was affirmed by the world. You go, Jerry, you're great. So why? And the greater I felt, the worse I felt inside because of that mismatch. So
you know that movie and that line in the movie, most the guys on the train coming, I think he's coming home from the city. It might have been Richard Gere, but I'm not sure. And he said, most men lead lives of quiet desperation.
He's quoting Emerson, I believe, who said that in the late 19th century. And he said, the vast majority of men lead lives of quiet desperation. It's quiet desperation. It's this sense of, what the fuck am I doing with my life? And for me, the morning of February 2nd, 2002, I was downtown right outside the Pile. I had gone to an Olympic bid effort committee meeting. We had space in an office building there because nobody wanted to be down there. And I came outside and I was struck by the desire to just jump in front of a subway. And I called my therapist. I'm here. I called my therapist and she said, get in a cab and come see me right now. And I did that. She was on Long Island. And the fact that I chose not to was the most profound expression of my agency. Because that's actually when I chose to no longer be dictated to, not by my past, but by the depression. I took control of my life, and it was a hard path out. But whatever good I do in the world today stems directly from that decision to not.
That's why you love that therapist so much.
God bless her. She was the good mother who saved me.
Yeah. So this gives us a great segue. I could talk to you forever, but I want to respect your time. I think there's so much wisdom that you have, and you're so genuine and authentic, and you are comfortable being vulnerable. So when you published, I want to talk a little bit about your book, Reboot: Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. You just shared with us your journey of growing up. So share with us what you like people to hear that will encourage them to want to run and order this book.
Well, there's a basic supposition, a basic premise behind everything that I do as a coach, and both in Reboot and in the new book, Reunion. And that is that, put simply, better humans make better leaders. And the process of being a better, I mean, it's obvious when you say it, but it's actually something we don't consider a lot. And the process of being a better human, or to use language from my first book, being a fully actualized adult, being a grown-up.
Oh, now we're talking psychobabble stuff.
But being a grown-up means taking responsibility for your life. It means understanding the agency that you do have. It means making good choices. Now, there's something I tried to demonstrate in both books, and something I tried to demonstrate even in this conversation. And that is, I am unafraid to tell my own story. And why is that important? Because I'm a white man. There's a shit ton of power that's projected onto me that I have nothing whatsoever to do with. And if I can lean into that space and be real, I tend not to use the word vulnerable, I tend to use the word real. If I can be real and be honest, then maybe, just maybe, I can make it safer for someone else, especially for those who don't have the power that I have. Because God knows it's fucking hard in our organizations. It's hard to be real. It's hard to feel safe. It's hard to feel like you matter. And the truth is, if if there's anything, you said it to me before, I'll say it back to you. If there's anything I want people to walk away with, is the realization that they're not alone. And then they're not, just because they feel broken doesn't mean they are broken.
Mm.
It just hurts. Growing up hurts. But that's not unusual. That's the process.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that you ever stop growing up?
Hell no.
It's always hurting. It's always hurting.
The last line of Reboot is, and with that, I mastered the art of growing up. Not the science, and with that, I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
I want to grow until the day I die.
What do you want people to say about you when you die? When you're dead, and we're all around the tombstone.
He made a difference.
Do you feel you have?
Most days.
I think so. All right, let me ask you my real last question. What's the one song you can't live without?
Growing Up by Bruce Springsteen.
Really? Why?
It's my anthem. When I was writing Reboot, I listened to that song every day. It's an anthem of declaring your independence. It's the thing, honestly, it's what got me through my teenage years. It's the thing that said, screw this, I'm going to be my own person. You know, my parents had a hard time. I'm not going to let that fact hold me back. And I hope my words, from my lips to God's ears, I hope my children can say the same thing. That whatever struggles their father had, it did not hold them back from being their own fully actualized human adult.
I hope we can say that for everyone, because everybody's
Amen.
parents all did the best they could.
Amen.
They all did the best they could. Okay, so Jerry, unabashedly go and promote yourself. Tell people where you want them to learn more about you, how they can follow you, how they can reach out for you, and where you'd like them to get. I mentioned your first book, but your newer book is The Reunion, Leadership and the Longing to Belong, although they're both valuable. So unabashedly go.
The best thing to do would be to go to reunion.reboot.io, not .com. And what you'll find there's actually a big video clip there. It's a 9-minute documentary of me going back home to Brooklyn, to the house that I was born in, a place I left 50 years ago.
What street was that?
377 East 26th Street, between Avenue D and Clarendon Road.
Flatbush
East
or
26.
Albemarle? Yeah.
Flatbush.
Yep.
Erasmus High School was
Erasmus Hall High School. Yep.
You got it.
Yep.
And then
surprised you didn't go to Brooklyn College.
Yeah, well, that's for another podcast.
Okay.
But that's the best place to find. You'll find podcasts. You'll find the ability to upload your own story of belonging, and there's some really interesting content on there. And then, of course, you can buy the book. Okay.
Thank you, Jerry, so much. This has been such a delight. I truly could go on and on and on. And for all the listeners, I encourage you to purchase Jerry's books. I cannot wait to go look at that video. Most the people from Brooklyn have wisdom that everyone would do well to learn from.
Amen.
I must say so myself. Thank you, Jerry.